The officer looked at me, looked at Gwendolyn Pierce, standing behind him with a stack of laminated papers, looked back at me, and then said, in the flattest, most professionally neutral voice I have ever heard from a law enforcement officer, "Sir, she is claiming that you have drained and are in possession of the community pool." I was standing in my own backyard in work shorts and rubber boots, next to a completely empty in-ground pool that my father had built with his own hands in 1987, holding a drainage hose in one hand and a coffee mug in the other. I had owned this house for 14 years. The pool had been on this property for 37 years. My name was on the deed. My father's original building permit was in my filing cabinet 8 feet from where I was standing. And Gwendolyn Pierce, HOA president of Creekwood Estates, was telling a uniformed police officer that I had somehow stolen a community swimming pool. What came next was not what Gwendolyn expected, not even close. My name is Philip Garrett. I am 52 years old, and I live in a house in Creekwood Estates, Georgia, that I inherited from my parents 14 years ago when my mother passed, my father having died 3 years before her. I grew up in this house. I learned to swim in this pool. My father built it the summer I turned 7 years old, working weekends from June through September with 2 of his friends, and it has been a feature of this backyard for every year of my life that I can remember with any clarity. I want to establish the pool's history with some precision because it is the bedrock of everything that happened. The pool is a 32-foot by 16-foot in-ground gunite pool, installed in 1987 under county building permit issued to my father, Raymond Garrett, at this specific address. It has its own dedicated electrical panel, its own plumbing connections, its own equipment pad with a pump, filter, and heater that have been replaced and upgraded several times over the decades. It is, in every legal and physical sense, a permanent fixture of my residential property, as documented as any other structural element of the house. Creekwood Estates itself is a development that grew up around and adjacent to several older properties in this part of Georgia, my family's house among them. My parents bought this land and built this house in 1979, well before any organized development activity in the immediate area. Creekwood Estates was built out through the 1990s and early 2000s on the surrounding parcels, eventually encompassing my family's property within its general geographic boundaries without actually incorporating us into the HOA. Our deed predates the HOA's formation. We were never asked to join, and we are not subject to the Creekwood Estates covenants. This point that I am not an HOA member, that my property is not subject to the Creekwood Estates covenants, and that the HOA has no authority over my land or structures, is one that I have had to clarify on multiple occasions over the 14 years I've lived here, with varying degrees of success depending on which HOA president happened to be in office at the time. Creekwood Estates has a community pool facility located about a quarter-mile from my property in the development's central amenity area. This community pool is a separate, entirely distinct structure, larger than my private pool, with a concrete deck, a pool house, and a maintenance shed, that was built by the developer as part of the community's original amenity package and has been maintained by the HOA ever since. I want to be absolutely clear about the distinction. There are 2 pools in the vicinity of Creekwood Estates. One is the HOA's community pool, located in the HOA's amenity center, owned and maintained by the HOA. The other is my private, family pool, located in my backyard, owned by me, built by my father in 1987, existing on property that has never been part of the HOA. These are not easily confused structures. They are located in different places, they look different, and anyone who had lived in Creekwood Estates for any length of time would know, without any ambiguity, which pool was which. Gwendolyn Pierce had lived in Creekwood Estates for 6 years and had been HOA president for 2. She had, in those 6 years, driven past the entrance to my property countless times. She had attended HOA events near the community pool dozens of times. She had, to my knowledge, never once been confused about which pool was the HOA's facility and which was mine. Which is why what happened on the morning of the draining was so genuinely remarkable. The draining was a planned, permitted maintenance project. My pool's interior surface, the original gunite application from 1987, resurfaced once in the early 2000s, had reached the end of its practical lifespan. The surface was cracked in several places, rough enough to be a hazard, and stained in ways that cleaning could no longer address. A full drain, surface preparation, and replastering was the appropriate solution, and I had obtained the necessary permit from the county, hired a licensed pool contractor named David Marsh, and scheduled the work for a specific week when the weather forecast was favorable for the plaster curing process. The draining itself began on a Tuesday morning. David and his crew arrived at 7:30, set up their equipment, connected the drainage hose to my sewer cleanout as required by county code, no drainage to the street or to storm drains, and began the process that would take most of the day to complete. I was home, working from my home office on the second floor, with occasional trips outside to check on the crew's progress. Everything proceeded normally through the morning. At approximately 11:15, I received a call on my cell phone from an unknown number. I answered. The caller identified herself as Gwendolyn Pierce, president of the Creekwood Estates HOA, and told me in a tone that I would describe as controlled but clearly agitated that she was aware of what was happening at my property and that I needed to stop the draining immediately. I asked her what specifically she believed was happening. She said she had received reports from community members that someone was draining the Creekwood Estates community pool without authorization. I told her that I was draining my private residential pool for a replastering project, that the work was fully permitted by the county, and that no HOA pool was involved. She said she had reason to believe otherwise. I told her my address, the pool's building permit date of 1987, and my name as the property owner, and suggested she verify these facts before making any further claims. She said she would be coming by to assess the situation personally. I said that was fine. I returned to my home office. David Marsh's crew continued working. The pool continued draining. GWENDOLYN arrives with company. I heard the cars approximately 45 minutes after the phone call. I went downstairs and walked to my back porch to find Gwendolyn Pierce standing at my backyard gate with a uniformed police officer beside her, and what appeared to be two other Creekwood Estates residents standing slightly behind them, apparently having come along as witnesses or support or simply out of curiosity. I opened the gate. The officer, a young man whose name tag identified him as Officer Damian Cole, introduced himself professionally and said he had received a call about a possible unauthorized drainage of a community facility and was there to assess the situation. I told him I was happy to help him assess it and invited him in. What followed was one of the more surreal conversations I have participated in as an adult. Gwendolyn, once inside my backyard and face-to-face with the reality of what she was looking at, my empty residential pool, David Marsh's crew with their equipment, the drainage hose running to my sewer cleanout, produced her stack of laminated papers and began explaining to Officer Cole that the community pool had been reporting operational issues and that she had received reports suggesting someone had tampered with or drained it, and that when she had come to investigate, she had found what was clearly unauthorized drainage activity on an adjacent property. Officer Cole asked her, with admirable patience, what specifically connected my pool to the community pool's operational issues. Gwendolyn said that the community pool and my pool were, in her understanding, connected through a shared drainage system, and that draining one would affect the other. There was a moment of silence. Officer Cole looked at me. I looked at Officer Cole. David Marsh, who had been listening from the equipment pad, made a sound that he quickly converted into a cough. I explained, as simply as I could, that residential in-ground pools do not share drainage systems with community pool facilities, that each pool has its own independent plumbing connected to its own sewer or drainage points, and that my pool had been draining to my own sewer cleanout all morning without any connection to any other structure. Gwendolyn said she had documentation suggesting a shared infrastructure arrangement. Officer Cole asked to see this documentation. Gwendolyn's laminated papers, which Officer Cole reviewed with careful professionalism while I stood beside him, were a collection of materials I want to describe specifically because they illuminate how completely her claim had been constructed from misread and misunderstood sources. The first document was a printout of a Creekwood Estates HOA newsletter from approximately 8 years ago, which mentioned, in a community updates section, that the HOA pool's mechanical system had been upgraded and that the community was fortunate to have access to one of the finest pool facilities in the greater Creekwood area. Gwendolyn had highlighted the phrase pool facilities and written a note in the margin suggesting this referred to multiple pools. The second document was a county property map printout showing the general vicinity of Creekwood Estates, on which Gwendolyn had drawn a circle in red marker around an area that encompassed both the HOA's amenity center and my property. She had labeled this area Community Pool District in her own handwriting. The third document was a printout of the Creekwood Estates Governing Documents section on common area amenities, which listed the community pool as a HOA-maintained facility and specified that it was available to all member residents. Gwendolyn had underlined the word all and added a handwritten note, includes adjacent properties. The fourth document was a Google Maps satellite image printout of the area, on which two pools were visible, the HOA's community pool and my private pool, with both circled in the same red marker and labeled collectively as HOA Pool Complex. Officer Cole reviewed all four of these documents, then he looked at me, then he looked at Gwendolyn. He said very carefully, "Ma'am, none of these documents establish any connection between this pool and the HOA's community pool. The circle on the map and the community pool district label appear to have been added by you, and there is no infrastructure connection between two separate residential pools." Gwendolyn said she believed the official records would show otherwise. Officer Cole asked what specific official records she was referring to. She said she would need to research it further, but that she was confident. "My documentation." I said at this point that I could provide documentation that might help clarify the situation, and asked if Officer Cole would like to see it. He said yes. I went inside and returned with 3 things from my filing cabinet: my property deed, with the 1979 purchase date, and the legal description of my parcel predating the Creekwood Estates development, the original 1987 building permit for the pool issued by the county to Raymond Garrett at my address, and the current county permit for the replastering project issued to me approximately 3 weeks earlier. Officer Cole reviewed all 3 documents. He spent slightly longer on the 1987 building permit than the others, and I noticed him cross-referencing the address against the paperwork Gwendolyn had brought. Then he handed the documents back to me, turned to Gwendolyn, and delivered the statement I quoted at the beginning of this story, that flat, professionally neutral observation that she was claiming I had drained and was in possession of the community pool. Gwendolyn said, with somewhat less certainty than she had been projecting, that she believed there was more to the situation than the documents showed. Officer Cole said, "Ma'am, this gentleman has a deed showing his family has owned this property since 1979, a building permit for this specific pool from 1987, and a current county permit for the maintenance work being performed today. I have no basis for any action here. Is there anything else you'd like me to address?" Gwendolyn said nothing for a long moment. Then she said she would be consulting with the HOA's attorney. Officer Cole said that was entirely her right, thanked me for my time, and left. Gwendolyn and her 2 companions left approximately 2 minutes after Officer Cole, without further conversation with me. David Marsh walked over from the equipment pad and said, "That was something." I told him I agreed and went inside to make another pot of coffee. End of part 1. I want to describe my state of mind in the hours following Gwendolyn's departure, because I think it matters to understanding the decisions I made in the days that followed. I was not angry, exactly. I was something closer to genuinely puzzled, not about Gwendolyn's general behavior patterns. Since I had enough experience with various HOA presidents over my 14 years in this house to have a realistic picture of the range of approaches people brought to that role. I was puzzled about the specific chain of reasoning that had led her from the community pool is having issues to the man in the house next to the development is draining it, without any apparent intermediate step of verification, reality checking, or consideration of the absolute basic question of whether a private residential pool built in 1987 could possibly be the same structure as a community amenity pool built in the late 1990s. The answer to that question, no, obviously not, was available to anyone who spent 30 seconds thinking about it, looking at a basic map, or reviewing any public record from the county. The police officer had figured it out from 3 documents in about 4 minutes. Gwendolyn had apparently not spent those 30 seconds before calling the police. I called my attorney that afternoon, a woman named Sandra Ose, who had handled my parents' estate and who I had continued to work with for property matters over the years, and described the morning's events in detail. Sandra listened to the entire account and then said, with a certain measured tone I recognized as her thinking carefully voice, "Philip, I want to understand the HOA's complaint about the community pool. Is there actually something wrong with the community pool, and did they somehow decide it was your fault?" It was a good question. I told her I didn't know the answer to either part. She said, "Let's find out. Because if the community pool is having problems that they're trying to attribute to you, and if they have an attorney drafting something based on Gwendolyn's theory, you need to know the full picture before anything formal arrives." I told her to proceed. What she found over the following week was, honestly, more interesting than I had anticipated. Part 2. What was actually happening with the HOA pool? Sandra's research into the HOA's actual community pool situation, conducted through a combination of public records requests, review of available HOA meeting minutes, and a conversation with a Creekwood Estates resident who happened to be Sandra's client on an unrelated matter, and who was willing to describe what was being discussed in the community, revealed the following picture. The Creekwood Estates community pool had, in fact, been experiencing a genuine operational problem for approximately 3 months. The pool's circulation system had developed a significant issue, a cracked return line that was causing the pool to lose water at a rate that the maintenance contractor had initially attributed to evaporation before the severity became undeniable. The pool had been operating at reduced water levels for several weeks, and the HOA had been getting complaints from residents about the condition of the amenity. The HOA had brought in a pool service company to diagnose the problem. The service company had identified the cracked return line, provided a repair estimate, and noted in their written assessment that the repair would require the pool to be temporarily drained. This was the context in which the HOA's situation existed when my pool happened to be drained for replastering on a Tuesday morning. Now a reasonable person would look at these 2 facts, the HOA pool needing to be drained for repairs, and my private pool coincidentally being drained for replastering around the same time, and recognize them as 2 completely separate events with no connection to each other. The community pool's cracked return line had nothing to do with my pool. My pool's replastering had nothing to do with the community pool. They were not connected plumbing. They were not connected in any way whatsoever. What Gwendolyn Pierce had apparently done, based on Sandra's research and the timeline it reconstructed, was receive news that the community pool needed to be drained for repairs, observe my pool being drained at roughly the same time, and arrive at a conclusion that I want to describe with all the careful precision it deserves. She had decided, without any evidence, without any physical basis, and without apparently consulting anyone with relevant expertise, that my draining my private pool had somehow caused or was somehow connected to the community pool's problems. Sandra put it plainly when she called me with her findings. Philip, she saw two draining events happening around the same time and concluded they were related. There is no other explanation for her theory that makes any sense. I asked Sandra if there was any possible innocent interpretation of Gwendolyn's position, any version of events where her confusion was understandable rather than simply baffling. Sandra thought about this for a moment and then said, I think the most charitable version is that she was already stressed about the community pool situation, saw your pool being drained without knowing your maintenance project was planned and permitted, and made a leap that no calm, careful review would have supported. But even the charitable version requires her to have not done even basic verification before calling the police. The HOA's attorney letter. Approximately 10 days after the incident, Sandra received a letter from the Creekwood Estates HOA's attorney, a man named Frederick Holloway, who practiced general HOA and real estate law in the area. The letter was shorter than I had expected given everything that had preceded it, and its tone was considerably less confident than Gwendolyn's manner had been in my backyard. The letter stated that the HOA had been investigating what it characterized as concerns regarding water management activities on adjacent non-member property potentially affecting community facilities, and asked that I preserve any records related to my pool draining project and agree to a meeting to discuss the situation. Sandra reviewed the letter and called me with her assessment. She said Frederick Holloway had, in her professional opinion, been given Gwendolyn's theory and had drafted the most legally careful version of it he could construct, while clearly being aware that the theory's actual evidentiary foundation was essentially non-existent. She said this letter is written by an attorney who knows his client's position is very weak, but who is obligated to advocate for her anyway. The potentially affecting community facilities language is doing an enormous amount of work for a claim with no factual support. I asked Sandra what she recommended. She said she would respond with a letter that accomplished three things: clearly stated my complete ownership of the private pool and its fully documented history going back to 1987, provided formal notice that the county building permit for the replastering project confirmed the work was authorized and appropriate, and put the HOA on notice that any further attempt to attribute their community pool's independent maintenance issues to activities on my private property would be considered legally actionable. She drafted and sent this letter within the week. Frederick Holloway's response came back about 2 weeks later. It was 3 sentences long. It stated that the HOA had completed its review of the situation, that it had determined my pool draining activity was unrelated to the community pool's maintenance concerns, and that the matter was considered closed. 3 sentences. After a police call, 4 laminated documents, a 2-week investigation, and an attorney letter. Sandra called to tell me the response had arrived and read it to me over the phone. I said, "That's it." She said, "That's it. Frederick Holloway is a professional and he knew what this was from the beginning." The formal record and the apology question. I want to address something Sandra raised after the HOA's closing letter arrived, because I think it reflects an important dimension of how I thought about the situation's resolution. Sandra asked me whether I wanted to pursue anything further, specifically whether I wanted to seek any formal acknowledgement from the HOA or from Gwendolyn personally for the incident, or whether the HOA's letter closing the matter was sufficient. I thought about this carefully because I think the answer reflects something genuine about what I actually wanted from the situation. I did not want money from Gwendolyn or from the HOA. The incident had been genuinely bizarre and had cost me a morning's stress and a few hours of my attorney's time, but it had not caused me financial harm in any concrete sense. The pool replastering project had proceeded normally and was completed on schedule. David Marsh and his crew had continued their work without interruption once Officer Cole departed. I did not want a public humiliation for Gwendolyn. I live in this neighborhood. I have to continue to be a neighbor to these people, HOA member or not, and the kind of ongoing antagonism that a formal apology demand can create didn't serve any purpose I valued. What I did want, and what I communicated to Sandra to communicate to the HOA through whatever channels were appropriate, was a simple, practical thing. That the Creekwood Estates HOA update its own internal records to clearly note that my property was not an HOA member property, that my pool was a private residential pool with an independent 37-year history predating the development, and that any future concerns about my property should begin with a review of public county records before escalating to resident notification or law enforcement contact. Sandra conveyed this in a closing letter to Frederick Holloway. Frederick Holloway conveyed it, presumably, to the HOA board. Whether they actually did it, I cannot verify. I don't have access to their internal records, but I consider having asked for it to be the appropriate thing to do. The community pool. I want to complete the picture by describing what happened with the actual Creekwood Estates community pool, because it was the genuine problem that, tangled with some very confused thinking, had produced the whole situation. The cracked return line was repaired by a licensed pool contractor about 3 weeks after my pool was drained, entirely separately, for entirely legitimate maintenance reasons, with the pool properly drained by the HOA's own contractor at their own facility. The repair was completed successfully, the pool was refilled and returned to service, and from what I observed over the following months, it has operated normally since. None of my replastering project had anything to do with the community pool's problem or its solution. These were two pools, independently maintained by two separate parties, each going through their own maintenance cycles in something like temporal proximity through pure coincidence. David Marsh completed my replastering project on schedule. The new plaster surface is genuinely beautiful, a soft blue-white that transforms the look of the pool, and that my father would have appreciated given how much care he put into building it in the summer of 1987. I filled it in mid-May and used it through a full summer for the first time in several years, without the anxiety of watching the old surface deteriorate further. I thought about my father often that summer, sitting by the pool on evenings after work, the way you sometimes think about people when you're in a place that holds their effort and their care in its literal physical structure. He would have found the whole situation with Gwendolyn extremely funny. GWNDOLYN Pierce, and what came next? I want to address Gwendolyn's situation after the incident because I think it's part of the complete picture. I don't know the full internal dynamics of what happened within the Creekwood Estates HOA in the weeks and months after the letter closing the matter was sent. What I can observe, from my position as a neighbor who is not a member but who lives adjacent to the development and has some general awareness of what's happening there, is that Gwendolyn became considerably less visible in community leadership activities over the months that followed. She was at the position of HOA president for another 6 months after the incident, before a board election resulted in a new president, a practical, calm man named Robert Tillery, whom I've spoken with briefly on a couple of occasions, and who seems to have a much more grounded approach to the role. My interactions with the HOA have been, since the new leadership took over, entirely unremarkable. A couple of form letters about community events I didn't attend, one informational notice about road maintenance in the development that was relevant to parking on my street, nothing requiring any response or attention. What I want to say about my father's pool. I've been asked a few times since this story became something I occasionally tell people, whether I was worried during the incident, whether there was any moment where I thought the situation might actually cause me a real problem. Honestly, no. The documentation was too clear and too old. A 1987 building permit is not a document that disappears under scrutiny. An unbroken chain of ownership going back to 1979 is not something anyone can dispute successfully with a circle drawn in red marker on a Google Maps printout. What I did feel in those minutes while Officer Cole was reviewing Gwendolyn's laminated papers, was something closer to a specific kind of sadness, not personal, not directed at anyone, but a kind of general sadness about how a situation had arrived at this point. My father built this pool. He dug the ground and poured the gunite and tiled the walls and filled it with a garden hose over 3 days one summer, because that was faster than he thought it would be, and he was impatient to see it full. He taught me to swim in it. My mother sat at the edge of it with a glass of iced tea on summer evenings for 20 years. This pool has a history. It has a permit number and a recorded address and a family that made it. None of that needed a police officer to confirm it, but it turned out it did need confirming, and it confirmed cleanly. My name is on the deed now. My father's name is on the building permit. That is the complete story of who owns this pool, and it was always going to be enough. That's the whole story. The end. Thumbnail text, OPTIONS. Option 1. SHE told the cops, I stole the NEIGHBORHOOD pool. I had the 1987 permit. Option 2. My dad built this pool. She called the police over it. Option 3. Draining MY own pool. COPS SHOWEDUP. Deed ENDDIT in MINUTES. Option 4. SHE circled 2 pools on a map. The officer was not impressed. Option 5. 1987 building permit vs laminated papers. Not even close. Script total, ~8, 500 words part 1, words part 2 combined, ~16, 100 words. Part 1 ends. Sandra finds out the real HOA pool situation. Gwendolyn connected 2 unrelated draining events with 0 evidence. Part 2 delivers. HOA attorney's weak letter, Sandra's precise response, case closed in 3 sentences, pool replastered beautifully, father's memory honored.